within my consciousness lies many gaming factoid corrections that no one really asked for. The Dragon King part is just a transliteration of the city name. Miyamoto only sketched the box art, not the final piece. Sonic Vor was always called that, and perhaps the most contrarian of them all, it's BA, not BA Start. I'm not giving any additional context for all that. I always crave knowledge. I always want to know the truth behind oddities in my favorite games. And lately, I've been thinking about why Link's hair is, colored that way. In the collective childhood poltergeist we dub The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I thought it would be simple. I vividly remember someone from Nintendo giving a pretty clear answer to the pink hair. That it was an intentional decision to make Link stand out better in the environment. Now, I don't know if I learned this as a random factoid in a Did You Know Gaming video, or some other online source in a similar vein to that channel, but I know one thing for certain. I haven't been able to find proof of an official definitive comment on the matter. I've performed preliminary Google searches, a lot of people asking about this very thing, but none coming to a concrete conclusion. I looked at the game's Wikipedia article, the only good search engine in 2026, and still no dice. If there was an official reason given for Link's odd hair color, you'd think everyone would be pointing to it, right? So the lack of a solid consensus likely meant one never really existed, or if it did, it must have completely flew under the radar. Without a solid lead, I sorta needed to start from square one. What do people think was the actual cause for Link's pink hair in A Link to the Past? Among the disarray of conjecture across multiple Reddit threads and forum posts, there was one specific answer that kept coming up more than the rest. Perhaps the easiest response one could give to an odd color choice in a 30-plus-year-old game. Is it a hardware limitation? Or more precisely, a color palette limitation? To most people watching this video, you're probably familiar with the whole design decisions driven by the hardware prowess shtick by now. People toss it at virtually any remotely odd design element in older games, even when it isn't particularly relevant. But as much as it might be erroneously thrown around, there's obviously some merit present to that sentiment, especially as to the color choices in many retro games. Besides the brown and red clothes, Mario sports an odd yellow color for his overall buttons and skin. Batman for NES, loosely adapted from the 1989 film of the same name, features an all-purple version of the character with no visible skin at all. And Simon Belmont is white. Color swatches on NES had to be compromised to best represent multiple elements of a given character design, with the occasional overlapping sprite to add a dash more color if absolutely needed. But a lot of that color weirdness mainly pertains to 8-bit systems like the NES and its contemporaries, the former not even having set-in-stone colors to pick from to begin with. On the SNES, Mario mostly looks like himself. Batman has actual skin tones present, and Simon Belmont has clearly defined separation between his body and attire. 16 colors per sprite, while not entirely liberating, is still plenty enough for most characters on the system, so how isn't it enough for Link? Well, it is, actually. Because as it turns out, Bunny Link, the primary suspect behind Link's need for pink hair, uses an entirely different palette line compared to his regular form. I won't go too deep into the specifics, but even just eyeballing the colors used on both sprites makes it evident that there's simply not as many shades of pink for Link to pick from outside of the bunny form. Even across the two other tunics you adorn across a playthrough, as weird and different as they make Link look, giving him an almost technicolor appearance because of the differing torso and hat colors, Link still retains the same shade of pink for his hair. It really appears that the artists could have given Link his more typical hair color if they wanted to, without causing any collateral damage in other parts of the game. But despite how clear the answer may seem at this point, there's another quirk we need to address pertaining to Link's color palette in this game, possibly one you might have never noticed before when playing. As I spoke of earlier, my search for any sort of conclusive answer to the pink hair dilemma led me to various forum threads, and I happened to come across a particularly interesting one hosted on zeldadungeon.net, which you might also know for being an extensive wiki in its own right for the Zelda games. At the end of the thread's first page, one of the site's admins chimed in with a very interesting response, relaying a dissertation of a complex bug purporting to be the real cause behind Link having pink hair in A Link to the Past. But even for someone like me, who's slightly more technically knowledgeable about old game consoles than the average person, it was kind of difficult to fully wrap my head around the exact explanation. So eventually I caved, and started a new playthrough of the game to see if I could replicate the bug, which as it turns out is not only easy, but something most people are inevitably going to trigger during gameplay. Every time you open the overworld map, Link will automatically be made to use his regular palette, these ones right here depending on your tunic. But once you obtain the Power Glove, and later the Titan's Mitt, some sort of extra modifier is added, changing the color swatch used for Link's hands. A detail which is so subtle, it's possible you never realized the overworld map makes their color revert. But once you get your first glimpse of the Dark World on Death Mountain, before obtaining the Moon Pearl to be able to retain your original form, and you do the very same thing, things get a bit more messed up. Again, I'm not an ultra hacker man type, so I'm mainly going off what I'm seeing in action, rather than the actual logic behind it. But from what I can tell, Bunny Link's color palette is treated differently than the other full body outfit changes, for whatever reason, so it becomes subject to the same palette reversion bug as the glove upgrades, resulting in an appearance that, while not completely messed up, still immediately jumps out as off-looking with the mixing of hues on the fur. This is yet another way the differences between Bunny and regular Link's palettes emerge, but importantly, their similarity was, supposedly, decided to minimize the impact of the bug. For ROM hacks that incorporate more extensive pre-Moon Pearl Dark World segments, namely randomizers, it can be a huge hassle if either of Link's forms get changed to use significantly different palettes from one another, which easily results in massive visual glitches from a common player action, and only fixing itself when entering an interior area. It took over 25 years after the game's release for modders to figure out the exact circumstances behind the bug, and finally make a fix available for both players and fellow hackers alike. Maybe the sheer complexity involved is why it took until the GBA release in 2002 for the palette issue to be officially fixed, if at the cost of the alternate glove colors. Yet still, this is another instance where Link's pink hair doesn't really help the problem. If anything, it's likely exasperating the severity of this glitch by its presence in the first place. In fact, let's swap out that shade of pink for a different color, like a shade of brown halfway between Link's skin tone and his sleeves, which gives us a far more accurate representation of his established color scheme at the time. And wouldn't you know, this also results in Bunny Link's glitched palette looking completely normal. A different hue, sure, but it's a lot less distracting than the weird melding of a bright pink against two shades of brown. Also, bunnies tend to be brown, like in real life. Shit, you could change the pink to that of its equivalent on the bunny palette, and it still looks stylistically cohesive without affecting either of Link's forms too dramatically. Or you could even fast-track history by reusing the yellow from his belt for the hair, which happens to be consistent between all of Link's appearances. There's so many ways to plug this hole more seamlessly, which don't involve a bright pink accent color, that it makes me question the whole narrative of it being a technical issue in the first place. So like, is this entire train of thought that seems reasonable enough on the surface completely baseless? Well, I'm not gonna pretend like I know that for certain, but... Okay, maybe this isn't exactly the deepest answer, but even without any sort of official word, there's still something important to go over in regards to the color choice being deliberate. Though I'm going to preface, we'll be solely looking at data, which isn't going to be fully reflective of developer intent. What kind of data, you ask? Well, let me provide some context. You might already guess where this is going, but in early 2018, Nintendo's internal servers were breached by someone who had previously hacked other big companies like Microsoft and VTech. But this incident fell under the radar of most. That is, until the approximate 2 terabytes of illegally obtained data started to make its way onto the public-facing internet, anonymously released by those whom the initial hacker likely shared the data with prior to their arrest. It took until 2020 for most people to put the pieces together of what was really going down, a year marked by an extensive flood of internal Nintendo data that had been obtained 2 years prior. Or in other words, the Giga Leak. One of the most notable things found among this slew of leaks were digital backups of numbered tapes Nintendo had stored various internal material on, with what was available of the uncorrupted backups containing developer-specific directories, with files dating as far back as the late 80s, in the midst of the Super Famicom's production and its respective first-party software. And through various bits of source code, sprite sketchpads, and other game data scattered across several directories, we can piece together a decent timeline of A Link to the Past's development, if an incomplete and out-of-context timeline. And by we, I mainly mean the cutting room floor and its contributors. I am nowhere near qualified enough to be on the front lines of data mining for this stuff, so I can't thank the wonderful folks enough who put in the time to document and write about all of this data. Shoutouts, by the way. So, okay, we have really early sprites of Link in the overworld, circa 1990, though it's difficult to pinpoint the exact date due to some technical timestamp related shenanigans. What do they look like? Well, there you have it. Keep in mind, we know how long the game's development lasted from these very leaks, March 1989 to October 1991, and across every set of sprites of Link uncovered in the GigaLeak, almost all of them depict Link with pink hair, and in the case of these earlier iterations, they include an extra shade of pink for additional detail which isn't present in the final version. And for the few instances where his hair is a different color, pink is still included as a part of the palette line, though I personally suspect that's because of a palette mismatch more than anything. It was even being used for his mouth at an earlier point in time. At least, going off how the TCRF page presents this information. While we don't know the full picture, and we may never learn much more, I'm confident this fairly bizarre color choice was made purposely to give Link some stylistic flair. In general, it's hard to understate just how unconventional Link is. A character who, even in his most serious-looking incarnations, always carries some of that carefree Peter Pan-esque youthfulness amidst a cyclical battle against an ancient evil, instead of a testosterone-fueled warrior you might expect for the role in this kind of story. Not a beast against beast, but a boy willing to take up the mantle of heroism without losing the part of him that's curious about the world around him, like a pink-furred bunny rabbit. Or Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood nature expeditions that inspired the Zelda series in the first place. And I think that off-kilter, sometimes deliberately androgynous lens is what makes these games so narratively enrapturing to begin with. Or at least the pink helps make him stand out better against the greens and browns found throughout the light world, though I can't fully speak to the effectiveness of which as a non-CRT haver. And that's the thing. We only have so much information to go off, even in the aftermath of one of the biggest gaming-related data breaches in recent history. This is why I had to preface this section with a whole summary of the GigaLeak. It is way too easy for misinformation to be perpetuated about these sorts of things because of their very nature. A motherload of ancient files using data structures which aren't all easily parsed in readily accessible PC software. I don't necessarily consider myself exempt from spreading misinfo about this stuff, but I've tried to do a bit of research into this to hopefully provide a more informed narrative, and, in general, maybe clear up what the GigaLeak even was to begin with, beyond the Luigi models and full-fidelity Star Fox voice clips that have colored most people's perception. So much of this discourse, the few times where the pink hair is interrogated beyond the typical one-off comment, hinges on surface-level guesswork without a solid frame of reference for how the SNES hardware actually plays a role in the game's look and feel, or in this instance, how it isn't really the driving factor behind an idiosyncratic visual element. And as much as I'd like to say I have a definitive answer, the data I've gone over, especially the GigaLeak, can only take one so far in understanding the full intent behind minute creative decisions like this. And I'm gonna be honest, I think it's worth looking into this game's idiosyncrasies on every front, instead of continually brushing them aside, or heralding its 64-bit successor for things that it may have not necessarily been the first entry to establish. Not to say this game is underrated, of course, but if I were to put it another way, A Link to the Past is fucking Kino. Genuinely. Through my spur-of-the-moment full playthrough I did in my research for this video, it became immensely apparent that this game had a whole lot more going on than when I played it as a kid, or even as a teen. A point that people like to parrot about this game compared to Ocarina of Time is how much more snappy the pacing is overall. Maybe it was John Egoraptor who drilled in the sentiment of how much waiting there is in Ocarina, but something you'll likely catch on to when playing A Link to the Past, especially for ROM hacks with heightened difficulty, is that you really can't haphazardly throw yourself at enemies. Even against the game's earliest foes, your sword will parry that of the guards, your arrow will get caught midair by another, your shit will get smacked by that spiked flail, and in response, you'll need to adapt, which might mean not initiating a confrontation at first sight. As much as A Link to the Past pulls from Zelda 1, it carries over quite a bit of Zelda 2's intricate swordplay and builds upon it with an expanded arsenal derived from the former, which in turn adds a lot more depth to the combat and, by extension, leverages realism, or cinema. It's honestly kind of shocking how much dialogue is in this game, given how much the overall story comes off pretty plain, especially in retrospect. But the game wants you to linger a little longer, on the elder you meet near East Palace, rescuing one of the 7 maidens sealed in the Dark World, and guiding the old man through the caves to Death Mountain, even if you can ultimately skip past most of it, and beeline past the paths that might have been dead ends. It's those adventure/RPG sensibilities seeping in, of course, but put together with the game design, it feels like a more pointed vision. Shiggy-diggy Miyazaki's vision, one could say. This game has the most amount of conventional dungeons in Zelda history, yet its narrative doesn't feel compromised by the wealth of game content. It manages to feel like just the perfect amount. And as I acknowledged earlier, like many classic games, there's a dedicated ROM hacking community for those seeking out the visions of others, if smaller in size compared to the Crimson Carpenter. Parallel Worlds, as bullshit as the challenges it presents are, ultimately brings the systems of the original game to new heights. Having to do nearly an entire dungeon without your sword and shield allows for the intricacies of the guard's AI to really shine. It forced me to become a better player, it forced me to better understand all these systems to begin with, and it forced me to pass the torch, lantern, of what the kids in the 90s thought of it. Might have. I don't know, I wasn't there. Whether through fan games, other official Zelda games, or even the literal sequel/remake hybrid, A Link to the Past spirit has never been more widespread. So maybe it isn't all that special anymore, or even necessarily my favorite to begin with. Maybe it is just the blueprint that all future Zelda games build on top of. But A Link to the Past still has vignettes of a larger world, sword upgrades that go beyond mastery, an astonishing number of diverse and thematically appropriate dungeons, the secret rupee room reached from a precise sequence of actions, a crazy out-of-bounds glitch letting you see how every interior area in the game is interconnected, and of course, the pink hair. It has the sauce, tasty sauce, with a bit of punch to it. Probably a bit of Octorok in there, to be honest. Just a whole bunch of random bullshit tossed in a pot that comes out magnificent. And it's kinda hard to find that anywhere else.